Hello and welcome to a very special episode of The Winning Agenda. We have a guest here with us, Elli, the Worldbreakers designer, and also, as we can see just over your left shoulder there, a former Netrunner player. Um,
Yes,
Elli and I met for the first time in 2014, I think, at the World Championships of Netrunner. And Elli, what have you been doing since then?
I've been playing Netrunner until 2015 or so,
Hmm.
and I've been playtesting Netrunner until 2016. And I've been
With
doing
Fantasy
some,
Flight Games?
yes, with
Yeah.
Fantasy Flight, almost until they lost the license,
Hmm.
sadly. So that's on the Netrunner side of things. And in my civilian life, I've been running a company for biological research. And in May last year, I started working in earnest on my new game, Worldbreakers, which I've been in some state of development for since 2016, but really made it more central about 7 months ago.
Okay. So biological research and games, those are your two passions, are
That's a that's a pretty ample summary
they?
of my life. Yes, I also have like a family and children, but yes, the uh, the main passion is biological research and gaming, in particular card games.
Okay, fantastic. And so, since Netrunner has sort of been a little bit more difficult to play in an organised way, and since Fantasy Flight lost the license, you've reached out now about World Breakers to me, and what was really interesting for me in setting up this interview was the way that you described the game and the influences on it, and the influences on your development. So, do you want to talk our audience through sort of what you drew from when you were trying to conceptualize the gameplay and the mechanics of World Breakers?
Yeah, certainly. And ever since I stopped playing Netrunner, I've been working on different ideas that really revolve around the same engine. I think that the economic engine of Netrunner is so smart that you have clicks and credits and cards that I'm baffled that there aren't more games that use it. There's Netrunner, there's Arkham Horror LCG. That's pretty much it. So different variants of that particular engine, including just my own tiny Netrunner reboots.
Mm-hmm.
And the big breakthrough was last year when instead of starting from um, how to fix Netrunner, so to speak, which is something that I think Nisei has done remarkably well. I really love what they've done with the game. Instead, starting from a bit more of a clean slate and thinking, let's just take the core of Netrunner, the things I love the most about the game, and just spin off a new game from these first principles.
Mm-hmm. And so, what were some of the first principles you've mentioned? The clicks, the credits, the cards as the kind of economic engine of the game. Um, was that the main influence on how you came to sort of develop the basis of World Breakers, or were there other games that also influenced the way that you thought about that?
I think Netrunner brought two big things. One
Mm-hmm.
of them is the engine with the clicks, the credits, and the cards. And the second thing is the dynamic between the players, which I've heard described as either a game of cat and mouse or as a game of chicken,
Mm-hmm.
where both players oftentimes know what they want to do and they know what the other player, the opponent, is trying to do. It's just about the timing of it.
Mm.
And is now the right time to install my agenda and advance it? Is now the right time to run that remote? Can I afford not running that remote
Mm.
right now? So I think a lot of the tension that I like about Netrunner is these types of questions where it seems like you can go for your plan and push your agenda, but you're not absolutely sure, and there is a matter of fitting your opponent and taking the risks. So that was one big contributor. Um, Another one is Magic the Gathering,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is the second best card game after Android Netrunner, after
Mm.
Netrunner as a whole. And what I like about Magic, at least in its purest form, is that it's fast.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of back and forth between the players. I think that's one thing that Hearthstone really improved on. That it feels like There's really quick interaction. And I believe that Flesh and Blood has elevated it to a new level. I think
Yes.
you're in a much better position to comment on that.
Mm,
It's really about trading blows
that's
as
right.
opposed to sitting there and thinking and thinking and thinking and just waiting for the other player
Mm,
to interact. So that's another big source of inspiration. And the third one is all of the awesome board games that have been coming up over the
mm-hmm.
past few decades. And my favorite genre is worker placement games,
Yes.
like Agricola, like Kalis, like Lords of Waterdeep. All of these games, one, they have this tension I mentioned before, where there's this prime spot that you want to take, but then there's also other spots on the board that your opponent might take ahead of you.
Mm,
So that's one part of them. And another part is the question of sequencing, where you want to get the wood, and then you want to build a room, and then you want to extend your family, using Agricola as an example.
mm-hmm.
And these three actions have to occur in this order. Otherwise, they won't work unless you want to stop your opponent, unless you want to make some concessions along the way. It's really a question of running the mental calculus and deciding whether you want to commit to that path, which is the optimal one, or you want to be more proactive and think about what your opponent is about to do.
Yeah. And in a lot of these games, even in something like Catan as a really basic example, development cards add an element of randomness where you could spend your resources and your time just building roads and trying to build settlements. But if your opponent obtains a development card and then is able to build two roads or is able to get monopoly and take all of one particular type of resources, then they can come back or escalate or accelerate their plan. So yeah, all those mental calculuses of is taking the safe and clear path. How's that going to work in terms of the race that's going on in this game? Yeah, all that stuff's quite interesting. So that playing with time, I guess, is what you've touched on there in terms of the timing of all your actions and weighing up the value of pursuing your own game plan versus disrupting your opponents. How have you, on a conceptual level, tried to work these into Worldbreakers?
I think that you've really hit the nail on the head with the word race. It's about getting there ahead of your opponent.
Yeah.
And talking about mechanics, a bit more details. In Worldbreakers, players accumulate power points as the game progresses, and your goal is to reach 10 power ahead of your opponent. In some ways, similar to the agenda points in Netrunner, where the first player to 7 is the one to win the game.
Okay, so power points, kind of victory points, agenda points, that sort of concept, I think. Yep.
Right. And that touches on somewhat of a design constraint I put into the game. And this is a big differentiator from Magic the Gathering, in my opinion. In Magic, and I believe that in Flesh and Blood as well, your goal is to lower your opponent to 0.
Yep.
You're trying to get them out of the game.
Mm-hmm.
While one of the things I like about Netrunner, about Catan, about Agricola, is that you're building yourself.
Mm.
You want to get to a certain amount of points. Mathematically, we can spin these the same, like mathematically they're the same thing.
Yes.
But from the perspective of the narrative of the game, I feel there's a very big difference between trying to kill someone as opposed to trying to achieve something ahead of your opponent. And that was important for me. So while Worldbreakers draws certain mechanics from Magic the Gathering, such as playing followers and using them to attack, even when the followers get through, you gain power, you build yourself. You don't destroy the other side.
Very interesting.
And I'm not sure that answered your question.
No,
but
that's okay.
It was interesting nevertheless.
No, it was very interesting. So you've got all of these different influences on your game. I guess the other element that I found really interesting reading through the information that you sent through about the game was the setting and the work that you've done on the theme and the flavor and the background of the game. Do you want to talk us a little bit through, I guess, the setting itself, but also some of the things that you've tried to achieve based on your values and the things you want this world to look like?
Yeah, certainly. Um, Worldbreakers is happening in the 13th century, in particular in an alternate version of the 13th century. And the game is set in Asia and the Middle East. So when you look at the cards, and I'm going to show a few cards in a couple of minutes, almost all of them are Asian, Mongol, Persian, Arab, Indian. Uh, there's a very wide diversity of different people on the cards. And going back to the basics, when I was designing the game, thematically, the goal was to go somewhere, which is not Europe. That was explicitly one of the big thematic goals. Europe is wonderful. I've been to Europe many times. I love to visit Europe, but from a gaming perspective, I just feel it's a bit stale by now. And you look at all the games out there, and they're just very heavy with European influence. So I wanted to go somewhere which is pre-European hegemony. And very quickly I found the 13th century, where there was this world system, that's the historical term, that connected the world from Eastern Asia all the way to Italy and even Central Europe and Egypt. And there was trade and there was transfer of people all across this huge amount of territory. And there was no one big power that controlled everyone. There were, for periods of time, powerful nations, and the Mongols are a great example. Under the great Genghis Khan, they controlled a big swath of land. But even then, there were multiple different players, and there were different connections between them. And for me, this shows that humanity can exist without having one big hegemony that dictates everything. So for the theme of the game, that was the starting point, and the main protagonist is Kutulun. She's a Mongol princess. She's based on a historical character. Marco Polo talks about her in his travels, and she was the daughter of one of the Khans of the Mongol Empire. And in the history of Worldbreakers, she becomes the dominant force who is reuniting the Mongol hordes with the intention of finishing the Great Khan's conquests and continuing the march of the hordes west into Europe.
Okay. And I think one of the things that is always a risk, I guess, in setting games or films or any kind of art in a particular cultural setting is, elements of cultural appropriation or whitewashing of cultures for the purpose of quote unquote diversity. What I found really interesting as well was that you'd taken quite significant steps to try and make sure that that wasn't what was happening with Worldbreakers through your research and other things. Did you want to sort of talk us just briefly through some of the work that you've done there?
Yeah, certainly. And it's interesting. I was in PAX Unplugged a couple of weeks ago, and there was a panel about decolonizing tabletop RPGs. And one of the things the panelists said is that, in his opinion, if you don't belong to a certain people, no amount of research will allow you to put yourself in their place, which I think is pretty accurate. So there's a few steps that I took with Worldbreakers to make sure that I try to stay as close as possible, not just to the history of the Mongol people and other people, but also to their essence. One part of it is a lot of research, which I think is essential. It's just not enough. So at this point, I have a big library of books about that period, about Mongolia. One of my favorites is right here, aptly named The Horde. And so that was one part of it. A second part is talking to consultants and advisors. In particular, I've worked closely with a professor of history in Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia. His name is Batbileg, and he designed much of how the Mongols look in the game.
Mm-hmm.
I've also worked with Bella Baira. She's a former Miss World Mongolia. She's been a cultural representative of Mongolia for years now. She worked on Netflix shows. She worked on films in Mongolia itself. So she's been a great source of information. I worked with Sel Greens. She's an historian in Columbia University, and her thesis is about gender in 13th century Mongolia. And her research is about how the perception of women in that period has been somewhat biased by the historical institution, and she's really bringing a fascinating perspective to the role of women in that society. So these were the three main experts I've worked on in the context of Mongolia. Another source is the art itself. So using the Mongolians as an example, most of the depiction of Mongolian people in the game were done by a Mongolian artist. He goes by Chinzu, and he drew almost all of the Mongolian people in the game. So I feel that when it comes to the representation of the Mongolian people in the game, I was more of a director than an actual designer.
Yes.
It was really about getting all these ideas and all these opinions from the experts and from people that are actually Mongolian and live there, and combining that into the game in a way which is interesting and accurate and respectful.
Oh, that's really fantastic to hear, Ellie. And I think that for anyone who buys and plays this game, undoubtedly what that will do is to give people a genuine insight into things that they may not have otherwise been aware of, and into a culture that many people in Western countries particularly wouldn't necessarily be familiar with, at least at the level of granular detail that a lot of the experts that you're working with are, in really subtle different ways. So that's fantastic to hear. And certainly something I'm excited about learning more about from the game. So what I think... no worries. So what I think might be interesting now for viewers is just to take a bit of a closer look at the game itself. So Elli's got the game programmed into Tabletop Simulator. And Ellie's just going to share their screen here, and we'll jump over so I'm not so in the way of everything that's going on. And Elli, I think we might start with the board that's in the middle of the screen here, that sort of horizontal board that looks somewhat like a click tracker from Netrunner, but operates a little bit differently. Do you want to talk us through maybe that, and then just from there, the main mechanics of the game?
Yes, certainly. Thank you for pointing that out. So very similarly to Netrunner, every round of Worldbreakers, you're going to have 4 turns, 4 actions that you can take. The big divergence from Netrunner, and also from Magic the Gathering, Hearthstone, many other such games, is that you're going to take just one action, and then your opponent is going to get an action. So I think this sheet is going to be very familiar to anyone who plays Netrunner. This is the type of actions you can take. So you can gain a Mythium, which is the game's currency, very similar to credits. You can draw a card, you can play a card, you can develop a location, which is the game's equivalent of advancing an agenda. So you can take all of these actions that Netrunner players will find very familiar. But as soon as you take them, this tracker is going to move to your opponent. And now they get to take one action.
And if we just pause there, Ellie, I think it's really fascinating. Could we just bring up that basic actions screen again? Because
yes,
as soon as I look at that, I can think of all of the concepts that you've just described coming from all those Euro games, the worker placement games, Netrunner and Magic, and it is all really clearly and interestingly distilled here, because this gives us really quickly as a new player an idea of what the value of all these different things is in this game. What's the value of a credit? What's the value of a card? What's the value of a victory point? Or a standing is a victory point, isn't it? So is that right?
So standing is a resource mechanic. Power is a victory point.
Power is a victory point. Okay. So we've got an idea of what a standing is in terms of value, 2 Mythium to 1 standing. And then similarly to Netrunner, which I really like, this idea that whenever you play a card, you're foregoing further resource gathering. Yeah, that
Yes.
playing takes an action, which you're foregoing drawing a card or gaining a resource to do that. So the times that you as well as developing, as you mentioned, which is similar to advancing an agenda. So the time that you spend developing your board, either by playing cards or developing locations or by attacking, you're foregoing resource generation. So you've got a really interesting choice on every one of your actions as to whether you want to be developing or progressing.
Yes. And the opposite is also true. If you take a moment to gain a Mythium or draw a card, you're foregoing the opportunity to play a
Yes.
card or attack your opponent. And in essence, everything has an opportunity cost.
Yeah.
I've described it as agonizing, but in a positive way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that calculation of opportunity cost and making it so obvious and clear to the player from the start, I think really helps to set the player's mindset when they approach the game as to how they're thinking about each one of their actions.
Right. So it's really tight because as soon as you do something, your opponent will have a chance to react to it. And it creates a lot of interesting dynamics. And I'll try to highlight a couple of them as we go through the different mechanics and cards. One of them that is relatively straightforward to highlight happens at the end of the round. So at this point, this is Marco Polo. So he's on the other side of the board.
And is
At this
that the
point,
hero card or the character card that player's using, or?
yes, that's the identity cards.
Yes.
They're called Worldbreaker cards in the game.
Mm-hmm.
So every player has a Worldbreaker, essentially an identity, and that comes with a certain special ability and with a starting standing, which is a type of resource. So as soon as Marco Polo takes his last action during the round, there's going to be a cleanup, which I'll touch on in a minute, but then this is going to flip. And now it's Marco Polo's turn again. So usually we're going to flip between us, but every other round, you're going to have 2 consecutive actions between which your opponent will not have a chance to respond. And one of the first skills that players are learning as they play the game is what is the meaning of that double action and how to prepare for it, both when you're going to get it and when your opponent is going to get it.
And that double action is interrupted each time by this cleanup phase, is that right?
Yes, the cleanup phase raises your followers and gets you some resources. That's typically all it does. So it's very similar to the untap phase in Magic the Gathering, or to the Corp drawing a card at the beginning of their turn. You just get some more stuff to your board and the game continues from there.
And both players do that in the rally phase, is that right?
Yes. Yep. Both players do it at the same time.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. So the double action, I mean, that's for other viewers of my channel, you know, Twilight Struggle is another game that I play a lot of, and that's a really key mechanic in Twilight Struggle and in generating tempo. You know, at the end of the turn, the US player has 2 effectively consecutive action rounds. With their last action round, they play last in the turn and then the headline. And the USSR player then has effectively 2 consecutive rounds, the headline, into their first action round. So yeah, I think that's a really fascinating way to prevent the game from just becoming this sort of endless 1-for-1 trade of back and forth, and introduce this opportunity for a tempo grabbing play.
Yeah, and I think the headline mechanic from Twilight Struggle is a great example of how they implemented that kind of tension really well.
And so talk us through, Elli, some of the things that our players can do in their turn. Should we have a look at Cthulhu's hero card, or what's an interesting way to take it forward?
So I do want to take a quick look at Cthulhu's hero card because the art was designed by Batbileg, who's an expert on Mongol armor and costumes of that time. So a lot of these elements just come from what we know about Genghis Khan and his people. Just a bit of an anecdote on how the art looks like.
Absolutely. That's
So
beautiful. It's amazing to see.
thanks. So the goal of the game is to get these 10 power, and you're just going to accumulate them as the game continues, as the game proceeds. And one central way to get them is through these cards called locations. And what locations do, you play them to the board, and then you load them up with stage counters, these small gray tokens. So one action is to play the location, and another action you can take is to develop the location. When you develop a location, you remove the top counter, and then you gain whatever that step says.
Right.
So in this particular case, developing the Indigo Grotto is going to get you 2 power. And if you get to develop it again, you'll gain 3 more power, and again, you'll gain 1 more power. So it's a total of 6 power, which is quite a lot when you just need 10 to win the game.
Absolutely. And how do you access these location cards? Do you just have all of them available to you at all times, or is there a separate deck of those that you have to draw from?
So the location cards are in your deck.
Okay.
And different decks have different amounts of location cards in them.
Okay.
Depending on their strategy. So using these 2 decks as an example, Cthulhu has about 2 of them, while Marco Polo has, I think, 8 or 9 different locations. There's big locations, there's small locations, there's locations that will give you resources in addition to power, and there's locations with special abilities on top of whichever power generation they have. So in this way, locations mimic agendas where you're going to develop them to gain the winning condition of the game, but also to impact the board as you're doing it.
And Elli, this is probably a good time to mention Worldbreakers is not a trading card game or a living card game. The decks are self-contained and pre-constructed. Is that right?
Yes. Thank you for raising that. The game box is going to have enough cards for 2 players to play the game. And there's going to be 4 pre-constructed decks. I've been playtesting all 6 matchups, and each of them is different and unique in some way. So you get a lot of replayability there. And also, the game is draftable. So if you like drafting, the box comes with 2-player draft rules. And in fact, Jamie from Nisei has been a huge contributor to Worldbreakers. They've been helping with the rules, they've been reviewing the cards, and they suggested the draft format. So if you like cube drafting, the game is really designed for that kind of experience as well. Excellent.
So how high does the Indigo Grotto go in the draft? Is it a high pick?
It really depends. And an interesting thing about a 2-player draft, it's really up to the players to decide how casual or how aggressive they want to be.
Yeah.
We've had drafts where nobody even wanted the Indigo Grotto. We had drafts where it was a highly contested card. It really depends on what's going on with the game. I would say that if it shows up early, it's usually a safe pick, but later in the draft, it's entirely possible nobody's going to want it.
Might not fit your strategy.
And it's a high risk, high reward card. So,
well, I think it's probably a good time to jump into what are the risks of these locations. You compare them to agendas, and obviously agendas can get stolen, but what can happen to your locations when you place them onto the board? You obviously spent a turn or an action point putting it out. Yeah.
So that's a great question. So this is what Worldbreakers gets from Netrunner. From Magic, Worldbreakers gets combat. So this is a game where you can attack your opponent, and when you attack, you exhaust your followers. And if your opponent cannot block, every follower that gets through is going to net you 1 power. So there's 2 separate paths to winning the game. One of them is to play the location cards and develop them, and the other is to play the creature, the followers, and attack your opponent. Furthermore, if you attack and your opponent cannot block, you can choose one of their locations to take 1 damage. So in this case, the Indigo Grotto is going to have 2 counters on it. If you attack and the followers are unblocked, you just take the top counter off. And at this point, you gain 2 power from attacking, and your opponent lost 3 power from that particular stage of the location.
Mm-hmm. Or they lost the
And
opportunity of 3 power.
right.
Yeah.
And going back to the timing structure of the game, this has a few interesting implications. One, if you play your location on your last action, on your last turn, you are guaranteed to flip and develop it at least once. That's something you can immediately do. And the second interesting interaction comes from some of these locations that have special abilities on them. And one I like to highlight, sorry, let me find it here.
No, that's all right. The cards just look beautiful, by the way. The art is fantastic.
Thank you. I'm trying to find the card, which is also very pretty. Here it is. So this card is called the Luminous Lagoon. And the first stage gives you a power and the moon standing, which is the resource mechanic. The second stage gains you 1 power and defeats an opponent's follower, the game's version of discarding that follower from play. So let's say you put this location on the board with your action, and it's your opponent's turn. Now they're facing an interesting decision, because if they attack and they remove that top counter, now it's your turn, and you can immediately use the second ability and defeat one of their followers. On the other hand, if they wait, maybe on your next turn, you're going to use the first ability, and now they can attack and remove that second ability, effectively nullifying it.
Yep.
So going back to the point I started from, we now have this game of chicken of, are you going to develop the location? Are you going to wait for my attack? And of course, in parallel to all this, there's different cards and events in the decks that could really change the calculation around that. So as you play the game more, you're more mindful of what kind of cards could be in your opponent's deck. Full disclosure, there is no account siphons in the game. But
no
there are abilities. There's no scorched earths because the flexibility of the power system actually gives alternative win conditions. But there are other surprises that could catch your opponent off guard. And the more you play, the more you know the card pool, the more you know what to expect, especially as you see your opponent taking certain actions. For example, let's say I'm playing versus the Council of Engineers, and their theme, they're really heavy control deck. They're a bit like HB heavy ice decks.
Yep.
And if I see them go from 6 Mythium to 7 Mythium, I'm going to be suspicious because they have a couple of really powerful cards in the 7 Mythium cost that, as a Cthulhu player, I should be mindful of. So even if you're just sticking to the pre-constructed decks, there's 6 different matchups and they play really differently from each other.
Fascinating. And Elli, the standing mechanic, I think, is something that we haven't really spoken about. One thing I actually want to check on the locations is if I attack with 2 followers, do I get to remove 2 counters, or is it only ever 1 that I remove?
It's only ever 1 unless you play certain cards.
Okay.
So just to give an easy example, the Void Guild, one of their cards is called Poison the Roots. And if you attack and the combat is successful, you get through, you get to damage a location 3 times instead of once. So when playing against a player that has Void standing, you should be mindful of that option, that if they can get through, they might deal much more substantial damage than you would have expected. Of course, every move has a counter move. And in the case of these particular mechanics, the Moon Guild has the Mason, which is a temporary name. And she allows you to nullify damage to locations. So if you have the Mason on the board, this card is actually not going to do anything, which is reflected in the art, which is connected between the two of them.
Yeah, nice. I really like that. It's an interesting tableau. So the do the symbols on those cards there reflect how much standing you need in order to play them? Is that a part of the cost?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. One of my least favorite things about Magic the Gathering is not having the right color of mana. And the way Android solved it is by having different factions. So during deck construction, you can splash off faction cards. And once you've done it, it's not going to influence the actual game. Everything is done during deck construction. So Worldbreakers has a bit of a middle ground between these two approaches, where cards have a standing requirement in the top left. So for example, the Chuva the Guru requires 2 earth standing to play. And over the course of the game, you can gain standing. So every Worldbreaker starts with 1 standing of their particular guild. In this case, Cthulhu starts with an earth standing because she belongs to the Earth Guild. And you can gain it. One way to gain it, as you pointed out, is to pay 2 Mythium and an action. And then this will go up. And now you've unlocked all of the 2 standing cards in your deck. You're not going to spend the standing when you play them. It's just a threshold that you need to go by. And once you go past that threshold, you can now play these cards. And likewise, the strongest cards in most of the decks require 3 standing. So usually your opponent knows that when you reach 3 standing, you probably mean business. And if it's my turn and I spend 2 of my Mythium to go up to 3 standing, and it's my opponent's turn, they should expect something big to come on my next turn or the next couple of turns.
It's really interesting. And like you say, I think it's an interesting way to balance out the splashes versus playing monocolor, if you like. You mentioned if people stick with the pre-constructed decks, does the game encourage people to mix and match between the different decks to arrive at, you know, their sort of favored combination of cards?
Yes, certainly. And I'm trying to reach different audiences without spreading myself too thin. One of the things I learned from speaking to Fantasy Flight people in an unofficial capacity is that most Netrunner players only got the core set, and they're just treating the game as a board game. They pick one of the precon runners, one of the precon corps, and thinking about the base box of Netrunner, that has an incredible amount of replayability. Just playing Shaper versus Wayland, Shaper versus HB, and so on, I think you can get between 50 and 100 games of Netrunner just playing these matchups.
I feel bad for the court players. Although, actually, a lot of the runner decks had pretty bad breakers too, didn't they? So yeah, it's just pretty low power overall. Yeah.
Yeah, every deck has at least one atrocious breaker.
Yeah.
So yeah, and the neutral ice, Enigma and Wall of Static are pretty decent. People are still playing them. People play them in tournaments for years after the core came out. And I think Enigma might still see some sporadic play. I'm not sure though. I could be mistaken.
I'm not sure. I'm not au fait enough with the metagame these days. But what approach have you taken with the Worldbreakers pre-constructed decks? You know, using that Netrunner core set as an example, the decks were pretty low powered compared to where you could end up once you explored the game mechanics fully. How have you approached the pre-constructed decks for Worldbreakers?
So the pre-constructed decks, each of them has 1 guild in them. So as you play, you don't have to think about getting standing with any of the other guilds. And also, every particular guild has a very clear identity and very clear strategy on what you want to do, which means that the matchups between them are relatively easy to figure out, but still challenging to master and challenging to play well. Then, once you feel that you had enough of the precons, and honestly, for many players, that's like 1 or 2 games. They play a couple of games and they want to move on to more sophisticated play. one thing you can do is you can play the two-player draft, and just build your decks from scratch. A third thing you can do is you can go into constructed play. And the constructed format is Highlander, so you can have one copy of each card in your deck.
Mm-hmm.
The game actually ships with 2 copies of the neutral cards. So if you have 2 players, you can build 2 separate constructed decks with just one box.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike other companies that require you to buy multiple boxes to
Yes.
buy, I won't name names. So if you want to go into constructed, then you definitely can. Right now, it seems like the best decks in constructed use 2 guilds inside the deck.
Mm-hmm.
And usually there's a primary guild and a secondary guild, and there's a lot of tweaking there. So we've played quite a few games of constructed. I'm not even I don't think we're even close to solving the meta, so to speak. And there's a lot of dynamics where if one deck becomes really popular, then some other deck is going to rise and overtake it. So the deck size is 30 cards. You have one copy of each, and the game ships with 112 cards. So there's quite a lot of diversity to what you can build. And we've seen some pretty cool stuff. As someone who designed the game, I'm pretty excited that players are doing stuff that surprises me.
Yeah, cool. Oh, that's
and
really
then I
interesting.
lose.
So, Ellie, we might jump back to your view so I can see you. So, me and the viewers can all see you properly. And we'll just have a bit of a wrap-up chat about
Sure.
Where to from here. So, you've got a Kickstarter that's going live in March to finalize the development and printing of the game. Do you want to tell our viewers a little bit about how they can get involved in that if they've liked what they've seen?
So even before that, don't buy anything without trying it first. Worldbreakers is on Tabletop Simulator and on Tabletopia. This includes the pre-cons, the constructed mode, the draft, and there's also a solo mode if you want to try it on Tabletopia. So you can just go and play the game right now. If you're looking for players, come to our Discord, and I'm going to give you the links so you can put everything in the video's description. And if you like what you see, please join the mailing list, and please subscribe to the YouTube channel. The game is coming to Kickstarter on March 1st. And as soon as it does, I'm going to let everyone know. It's going to be a super simple Kickstarter. You just go and you buy the game. There's no sophisticated tiers. There's no complicated stretch goals. The game box is going to be $30. We hope to ship worldwide, COVID notwithstanding. Right now, we're aiming for between $15 and $20 shipping cost, including to Australia and New Zealand. So it's really about focusing on the game. And if you like the game, I want you to be able to get it.
That's wonderful. Well, thanks, Ellie. The only other question that I had for you before I finish up is, do you have any organized play plans for Worldbreakers? Because I know that there are a lot of Netrunner players who enjoy, being able to test out their favorite constructed decks, or even, as you mentioned, with the draft format. Whether you're planning to host any kind of store or city or regional level events to support the organized play side of the game.
Yes, certainly. And I'm a big organized play player. That was one of the things that attracted me about Netrunner, the competitive aspect of the game. And we have plans for organized play kits. I'm speaking to multiple store owners to ask them what they like to see in these kinds of kits. And in my mind, it's really this like symbiotic relationship between the game, the designer, and the players and the stores. So the goal is to offer organized play kits. They're going to come with 2 different options. One is going to be a league that you can run over 2 months, and the other is going to be a tournament structure, similar to Android Netrunner. And every store owner can work with their community to decide what they prefer. It's going to be a seasonal structure. So every 2 months, the meta is going to change in some way.
Okay.
And it might be by banning or restricting some cards. It might be by unbanning cards. It might be by changing the rules of the game in some way or adding new cards just on a tournament by tournament basis. I was really inspired by Nisei's new format, the random access memory format that just provides a random card pool. The goal is to keep the meta fresh by changing the rules in some way every season.
Oh, that's really great. And I think for a game where people have all of the game pieces, preventing the meta from getting stale by changing things up is a great way to go about it, because you don't have that opportunity cost for players where they go, oh, well, I'm invested in this deck because I've paid a lot of money to buy these cards. So then if you go and change it up from under me, I feel like I've had the carpet pulled out, or, I feel like I've been lied to in some way. Whereas if they already have all the cards, you can change up the meta, and yeah, they might have spent some time investing time in playtesting their favorite deck or figuring out the meta, but isn't that part of the fun? If it's just a time and an experiential thing for people to go through that process again and refigure out the new meta, I think that's why we all play these games, to go through that process and enjoy that. So
yeah, I agree with you. And it's okay to have broken decks. I think people like playing broken decks. Playing broken decks is fun. You just don't want to play the same broken deck for 2 years.
Absolutely.
So it's okay to ban a card for a couple of months, but then you should know in a couple of months that card might come back and some other cards might get nerfed or banned or have some other restriction added to it. So really the goal is to keep players on their toes and shuffle things up every couple of months.
Yeah, and I think, I guess just to wrap up as well, obviously that's sort of slanting towards the more competitive meta organized play side of things, but one of the things that's fantastic, as you've described, you're appealing to a range of different audiences, and for those players who just want to have this game sitting on a shelf, pull it out once or twice a year, and just play one of the different matchups with, their partner or a family member or a friend whenever they have some time, it's obviously going to be a game that lends itself really well to that as well.
Yeah, and if you just grab it off the shelf and play, you're going to be done in 30 minutes. So it's not a big time investment. On the other hand, if you want to spend the morning drafting and playing the matchups again, you can also do that. It's really about flexibility and allowing the players to choose how they want to enjoy the game.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for your time, Elli. Thanks for joining and organising and reaching out to the Winning Agenda, and all the best with the Kickstarter. Look forward to seeing Worldbreakers grow and develop.
Thank you. March 1st. Subscribe to the mailing list.
Thanks, Elli. See ya.
Ciao.